Firstly, thanks to Paul Arts for first putting on the exhibition and also for inviting me to speak today, and the People's History Museum for putting on the exhibition in the first place. Okay, so my name's Helen Spandler. I work as an academic at the University of Central Lancashire, but I'm also a member of the Asylum collective, Asylum magazine. I'm going to talk about that quite a bit today. I also like to see myself as an activist, and I'm also an occasional advocate in mental health, and I hope an ally and critical friend of the psychiatric survivor service user movement. So what I want to do today is to talk about three interrelated things. Firstly, I want to say something about the psychiatric survivor movement and its history, as this is a historical event, and the history of Asylum magazine, and also something about psychiatric alternatives. And I want to focus a bit more on psychiatric alternatives in the current day. I think that's crucial to what might be happening now. So these three things are very interrelated. That's partly because the psychiatric survivor movement has always, in various guises, and we shouldn't really talk about the movement anymore. It's really movements. But for brevity, we'll talk about the movement. But in all its various guises, it's always campaigned for alternatives to the prevailing psychiatric system. And most importantly, it's always campaigned for different understandings and meanings about madness and distress. And more recently, we've seen the emergence of a mad movement and the seeds of mad studies. Not that dissimilar, or probably the most similar to queer studies. And of course, like queer studies, many lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered people don't particularly unnecessarily define as queer. But that hasn't stopped the development of a vibrant new field of inquiry, of a political and cultural practice of queer studies, and now starting to be mad studies. I'm not going to go into that too much today, but I think it's worth noting that's happening. So first I want to give a brief, very potted history of the psychiatric survivor movement, leading up to the launch of Asylum magazine in 1986. So, contrary to popular belief, the psychiatric survivor movement has quite a long history, and the history is being comprehensively documented by the Survivors History Group, of which I'm a member and also Anne was a member as well. And they have a wonderful timeline which you can access online. It's an online timeline. If you want any more details of that, you can either search for it or I can give you that. And I'd really recommend anyone who's interested in the history of the survivor movement to look at that. It's an incredibly valuable piece of history and an ongoing history, constantly being updated all the time. Okay, and I'm going to say a little bit more about them later. So when did it all begin? Well, it's interesting because there's a kind of possible survivor mythology around this. When I was writing my book called Asylum to Action, I think about 10 years ago now, and which was based on my PhD, I talked, as many other activists in the area talked about at the time, was the petition of the poor, distracted people of Bedlam in 1650. And I was one of a few people, really, to report on it. The Survivors History Group have interestingly pointed out there's actually no documentation of this petition at all. So it's something that may or may not be survivor mythology. We don't really know. But we certainly do know that there has been a lot of survivor action over the past 40 years, and much predated that as well. So where can we all begin? Well, there's a recent work that Survivors History Group have been doing. And there's various ways in which you can start any movement, really. But a recent thing that's popped up is, in the early 18th century, a chap born in Africa, he was a prince in Africa, Ukashaw Gronioshaw, his slave name, as it turned out, was James Albert, was a prince who was born near Lake Chad in Africa. He was a prince with a difference. He was considered insane. He was sold into slavery, became a domestic slave in New York, eventually he was granted freedom and crossed the Atlantic to England. He published later a slave narrative, which is probably the first slave narrative to ever have been published in England, in English. It's a narrative of the most remarkable particulars in the life of James Albert, Ukashaw, Granny O'Shaw, an African prince, as related by himself. So not only is it considered the first published work by an African in Britain, it's also the first slave narrative, and it may also be the first survivor narrative that we know of in the UK. That's interesting. I'm not sure the date it was published, but it was certainly probably mid-1700s. Okay, so until probably the late 1960s and early 1970s, which is the focus of most of my work, really, there tended to be a focus on wrongful detention. So in 1845, we saw the alleged Friends Lunatic Society set up in the UK, which was basically an organisation to campaign against wrongful detention. So underlying that idea, really, I suppose, was the idea that there might be right detention, and that some people were considered wrongly insane, but there were people who could considerably be rightly insane, if you see what I mean. But that's probably the first example of the organised survival movement that we have in this country. It wasn't until 1968, this is in Norway, that the first mental patients organisation of and by mental patients really developed. And they're called We Shall Overcome. And they are still in existence today, unlike most survivor organisations that started around that period. Okay, so in 1970, it was the first official patient council in Holland, in the Netherlands. Now, that was to become very influential to the patients and survivor movement in the 1980s. In Britain, we really saw the development of the Scottish Mental Patients Union, or the Mental Patients Union, and first the Scottish Mental Patients Union in Lanarkshire, in a very large, old-style mental hospital. In Lanarkshire, Hartwood Hospital. And not long after that, we saw the Mental Patients Union really thrive and develop in the UK. And for my PhD, I documented the Mental Patients Union as it arose in London and spread across the UK, starting with in a therapeutic community in West London called Paddington Day Hospital. We're on the MPU now. We can do a bit of MPU stuff here. Okay. So, one of the aims of the Mental Patients Union, really, was to set up alternatives, genuine alternatives to the psychiatric system, drop-in living centres, controlled by patients as retreats or crash pads, free from treatment and hierarchies. Now, this was the logo of the Mental Patients Union. You can't see it very well, but it's a head embedded in a spider's web. And this isn't the original picture on the Fish Manifesto. It was the first manifesto of the Mental Patients Union. There's a lot of discussion and debate about the status of the Fish Manifesto in the Mental Patients Union, which I won't go into. But this quote, which was on the front page of it, I think is a wonderful quote. I use it lots with in teaching and stuff. I'll just read it. An individual having unusual difficulties in coping with an environment struggles and kicks up the dust, as it were. I've used the figure of a fish caught on a hook. His or her gyrations must look peculiar to other fish that don't understand the circumstances. But his splashes are not his or her affliction. They are his effort to get rid of his affliction. And as every fisherman knows, his efforts may succeed. I love that quote. I think it's something, to me, now, it still summarises what the survival movement's really all about. I don't know if other people agree with me, but it certainly predates some of the ideas, for example, around the Hearing Voices Network that I know Ivan Luder talked about a few weeks ago here, in a talk that predated this. And the Hearing Voices Network sort of pioneered new ways of thinking about hearing voices. And they did this wonderful sort of experiment, if you like, a teaching experiment, where they got people to talk to each other in their voice with a rolled up newspaper and try and have a conversation with someone else while you're doing it, if that makes sense. So 3 people. So I talk to you like that in your ear, and you try and have a conversation with someone else while I'm talking in your ear. Now, of course, if you ever try that, try it at home by all means, you'll find that it's very difficult to have a conversation with someone else while someone's shouting things in your ear, particularly if they're not very pleasant things in your ear. And the survivorist movement, if you like, has often been about sort of showing how, in this sense, the splashes are not our affliction, but our efforts to get rid of our affliction. So in that scenario, when you're hearing voices and you're trying to have a conversation with someone else, you might turn and say things to the voice. Now, to everyone else who doesn't see the hook, which in this case is the voice, you don't know what the person's doing. It looks like a gyration, a peculiar gyration. So the survivor movement, in a way, is all, I think, a big part of it has been about trying to understand the fish on a hook, or the hook trying to explicate and illuminate what might be the hook. Anyway, I digress a bit with that. So what we saw with the Mental Patients Union was Mental Patients Union popping up all over the place, across the country. And that gave lots of really exciting possibilities for names, of course. So with SUMP in the Scottish Mental Patients Union, which is subtitled was something like a level below which you cannot sink. And we also had THUMP, the Tower Hamlets Mental Patients Union, Tower Hamlets Union of Mental Patients. Manchester, I'm not sure Manchester ever called themselves MUMP. I don't know about that. Do you know? Not to my knowledge, no. But there were lots of opportunities that maybe people didn't really grasp at the time, or maybe didn't want to, and that's just me, I don't know. Anyway, so, for example, back in Manchester, where we are now, in Manchester, there was an annual general meeting of the Mental Patients Union in 1974, which set up a federation of mental patients unions. That happened here. So after that, the Mental Patients Union did survive for a while, but then it kind of petered out a bit, but we did have organisations carrying on, such as the Campaign Against Psychiatric Oppression, and COPE, the Campaign for the Organisation of Psychiatric Emergencies. But what you started to get was much more influence from Europe around issues of patient advocacy and patient councils. So we then, in 1985, we had quite an interesting development where this is quite a well-known thing that happened in the survivor movement, where the World Mental Health Conference was held in Brighton, in the UK, in July 1985. Now, patient representatives were invited from places like America, Holland and Denmark, invited as speakers. But the English group weren't invited, service users weren't invited. So they put a stall up outside the conference to protest about this. So outraged, the international users and survivors negotiated with the conference organisers to allow them in, and they actually took over a section of the conference and helped develop a section of the Mental Health Charter. So that was a very good, wonderful example of solidarity across the movement. So this is a very, very positive history, really, but we now get to 1986, and 1986 is a really interesting year for the survivor movement. I don't quite know why. So in the UK at the time, we were all very depressed about the loss of the miners' strike, I imagine, and the loss or the defeat of collective action. But some very, very interesting things were happening in the survivor movement. I'll just give you some examples. So first of all, the Nottingham Patients Council was born. That was the first organised patients' council in England, and it went on to be a very, very influential organisation. The history's been written up recently by Marion Barnes. So that's one example. Another example, I don't know how old people are here, but the Channel 4 documentary 11 o'clock at night. It was called The 11th Hour. A wonderful docudrama called We're Not Mad, We're Angry. This is still being talked about now, and people may have seen it because you think you can get it on YouTube now. It was quite unique. It took about 2 years to make, but it's made up of current and former mental patients who had full editorial control of the drama. And many of the actors in the drama were patients, and they were all involved in the editing and production process. And it's really interesting to watch it now, because if you're involved in the survivor movement at all, you'll recognise nearly every one of them as who went on to become key survivor activists in the movement. People like Peter Campbell, Jan Warcraft, David Crepaz-Cray, people like that. So what else happened in 1986? Well, Survivors Speak Out started in 1986. Survivors Speak Out was probably one of the most important survivor user organisations in the UK, and Anne was the secretary of it for a while, I believe. Yeah. Treasurer, that's it. Treasurer of Survivors Speak Out. So if you want to know about Survivors Speak Out, ask Anne afterwards. They were a very important, influential organisation in the movement. What else happened? Well, the Bristol Crisis Service for Women was set up. And the Bristol Crisis Service for Women is still going today, and it's another very, very important organisation in the movement. Why is that? Well, an organisation like Bristol Crisis Service for Women was one organisation that brought together the women's movement and the psychiatric survivor movement, possibly for the first time. And it did it around the issue of sexual abuse and self-harm. And it organised a conference at the time as well on self-harm, looking at self-harm. So that began to revolutionise our understanding of self-harm. And nearer to home, in 1986, we had a meeting of patients and ex-patients from North Manchester General Hospital. I know some of you will be very familiar with North Manchester General Hospital, and most of you won't want to be familiar with it, but I'm afraid 1986 saw the first meeting of patients and ex-patients of that hospital, and which went on to develop North Manchester Users Group, which still exists today, now in the form of Manchester Users Support Network. And it is now very, very prominent in terms of fighting cuts to mental health services and alliances with trade unions such as Unison. That's just some examples of what happened in 1986. And the other thing that happened in 1986 was the launch of Asylum magazine, which I want to talk to you about. So, we kind of developed really out of all this stuff that was going on. Yeah. When it was launched, it was 50p. It's not 50p anymore, I'm sorry to say. But it was free to inmates, as we then said. People were patients in those days, so it was free to inmates. It doesn't say it on that issue, but it did later say free to inmates. So the first cover was an exclusive interview with R.P. Lang, Psychiatric Democracy in Italy and the Politics of Mental Health, which really signifies, I think, what the magazine for democratic psychiatry is all about, and pretty much still is all about today, really. And it sort of captures the intentions of its founders, who called themselves, I quote, a group of sufferers and professionals much influenced by the anti-psychiatry movement and galvanised into action by 2 visits to England of mental health workers from Italy who came as missionaries for the democratic psychiatry movement in Italy, Trieste. Now, how did this happen? Well, the University of Sheffield hosted these visitors, and the University of Sheffield, via Alec Jenner, who was a professor of psychiatry there at the time, made a little bit of a profit out of this. And Alec, in his infinite wisdom, managed to siphon off some of this money to set up Asylum magazine. We managed to get the magazine in production. I just want to say a few words about Alec Jenner, because I think he's a really interesting character. Alec Jenner was a biological psychiatrist, an old-school biological psychiatrist, actually. But over time, he became increasingly open-minded about his profession. And this partly came about from particular experience he had with pioneering one particular psychiatric drug. Now, Alec had heard, this is quite a famous story that people have heard of it, but in our circles. Alec had heard about a circus. Where was it? Where was this circus? Somewhere in Europe. He'd heard about where they'd used this particular drug to tame tigers, to calm tigers down in a circus. This doesn't put Asylum magazine in a particularly good light, but it's an important part of our story. And he thought to himself, perhaps this drug would help the people of Sheffield, or his patients in Sheffield. Now, what he ended up doing was he did the first randomized control trial of Valium and Librium, which are benzodiazepines. Now, Alec, as the good scientist that he was, set up a randomized control, gave the drugs to both. People didn't know which drug was which. And people reported feeling much, much better on what turned out to be Valium or lithium. If anyone's taken benzodiazepines, you'll know why. Reported very few side effects and generally much better than taking the placebo. So he was very pleased with his efforts. He didn't realise the addictive properties of these drugs, which were later to come out through various lawsuits. And as most of you know, many women were given these drugs and were addicted to them over long periods of time. So this experience, I think, really humbled Alec. And I think he realised that, things weren't ever quite as they seemed. And I think he became cautious, to put it mildly, about quick fixes and psychiatric cures. And he also became increasingly willing to listen to alternative viewpoints and radical viewpoints. He would never have described himself as a radical psychiatrist, particularly. He was always quite conventional. But what he was, and he would open up his house to various people over the years, many of his patients, many of the anti-psychiatrists around at the time. R.D. Lang used to sit and have supper with him. And he would genuinely try and understand and listen to these ideas. So, I won't say too much more about Alec for now. So Alec Jenner was very instrumental in setting the magazine up. Alec is still around now, but he's well into his 80s and isn't as involved as he used to be. But Phil Verdon was also set the magazine up at the time, and he was a sociologist who was sacked from York University and was always quite a maverick and very much involved in setting up magazines like this. And he's our executive editor now. And Lynn Bigwood, his wife, who was a psychiatric nurse and well known over the years for whistleblowing. And these three people are still involved in the magazine now. Now, Asylum magazine was and never been completely survivor and user run, as you can see. It could be one day, and we hope it will be. But it's always had patients and survivors at its core. And its initial aim was to struggle towards achieving what was thought to be the best of what we saw in Trieste, in the democratic psychiatry movement in Trieste. Because these people went to visit Trieste at the time and started to see some really exciting things that were going on. So people know about Trieste. They closed all the asylums and they set up genuinely real alternatives to the mental health system. Apartments, art studios, spaces for theatre and cinema, and a perpetual discussion of the meaning of madness and what to do about it, if you like, and to how to humanise mental health services. Full of cooperatives, restaurants, and small friendly units with beds for people to stay in crisis. So that was really the initial aim of Asylum magazine. Now that's obviously changed to some extent now, but I think it's still very much a part of our core values. But also another part of our core values, which goes back to the issue with Alec really, is a forum for opening up discussion and dialogue about the always tricky issues with mental health care. Within and between patients and workers, within and between survivors and different perspectives that survivors may have, and families and allies. Alec himself once famously wrote a piece in Asylum magazine, which didn't go down that well, in defending electroconvulsive therapy. And this is very much in the spirit of what Asylum magazine is all about, is to try and have these discussions, to talk about difficult issues, to not peddle a particular line. So, some examples over the years of the magazine. This is just a few examples, really. I think I've got, this one can stay here. But Asylum magazine has not ever been without its critics. And I won't go into those, and that's not just about our disorganisation, which we're getting better at. But the veteran US libertarian psychiatrist, Thomas Sachs, people may have heard of, wrote The Myth of Mental Illness and hundreds of other books about basically saying pretty much the same thing. He was probably the most anti-psychiatry psychiatrist of all the psychiatrists, even though he despised the term and would never have associated with it. He refused to put his name to the magazine because he claimed that democratic psychiatry was an oxymoron. Despite, or perhaps because of this, when he died, he devoted a whole issue of the magazine to his ideas. They didn't like that either, the Satsians, they didn't like it. We gave a very balanced view, but we didn't. Anyway. Okay, so Saz was not alone in thinking we were oxymorons. Many other radical mental health activists consider psychiatry to be, by definition, oppressive. For example, the mental health negotiators in the United Nations Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities argue that any separate mental health law or any form of forced treatment or detention contravenes human rights. It is, after all, mental health law which allows psychiatry to detain and treat people against their will. Now, this has always been a bone of contention among radical mental health activists and survivors. And I noticed this tension in the Furiously Mad booklet itself. So on the one hand, it begins saying we want to mark the 300-year hidden history of the locking up of the mentally ill, a practice which is alive and well today. Did you write? That'll be next year. No, it's not a criticism. No, don't worry. But later, it goes on to say the ever more desperate need for available inpatient psychiatric beds. Now, I think that is an important but very interesting paradox. That is at the heart of mental health or mad activism. I don't have necessarily, well, I have my own personal view on that, but I'm not going to. Asylum magazine's all about sort of debating and discussing these issues. But what's to say is mental health, by these very issues, really, of deprivation of liberty, is always going to be contentious. And as it would be, because we're talking here about the boundaries between the rational and the irrational, the reasonable and the unreasonable, the sane and the insane, and often between life and death. So Asylum magazine attempts to trying to keep these debates open and not close them down by imposing premature solutions. And after all, George Bernard Shaw said, I love this quote, I used to have it as a poster in my bedroom as a kid, the reasonable man, stroke woman, adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Let's have a little think about that one. And, do you want to go to the next one? This is not governed by exceeding reasonable limits. And the next one. Apparently, this Einstein said, if at first the idea is not absurd, then there will be no hope for it. And the next one, Mary O'Hagan, a very important survivor activist in New Zealand, said the oppressed are free to know differently. She wrote this wonderful book, Stopover on the Way Home from Mars. So what I'm saying, I guess, here in lots of different ways, and you can take from these quotes what you will, is that the so-called mentally ill, disordered, mad, distressed, whatever, may have a lot to teach us teach us all, not only about themselves, but about humanity, about our social relations and wider society. And as David Cooper said, madness is the expression of social contradictions against which we must struggle as such. David Cooper was interesting because David Cooper was the only anti-psychiatrist who called himself an anti-psychiatrist. He actually invented the term, so he probably would, but... Anyway, so the point of this is that this doesn't necessarily make mad people, if you like, whatever that is, necessarily right or easy to understand or translate. And this is kind of, in a way, the purpose of our magazine, is to give voice, but not in a sanitised way, not filtered through the gaze of clinical administrative practices, but to try and give madness in all its fora, if you like, space to breathe. Okay, so when we produced the tribute to Sachs, our readers prompted us to rethink what do we mean by democratic psychiatry? We had to really think about that again because, of course, Trieste was in the mid-1980s. Things have changed. So we asked our collective what we meant by democratic psychiatry. The quiz, if you can find it, is on our website. And I just want to read out a few quotes from it, really. I said something like, democratic psychiatry is aspirational. It's not an end in itself, nor is it necessarily seek a permanent substitute for psychiatry. But it's about widening, strengthening and deepening spaces where we can have an open and honest dialogue with and about madness. Dina Paul-Sanadu, our non-collective member behind, said, for me, democratic psychiatry is a particularly powerful articulation of an ideal, or rather a deep longing for, a humane and emancipatory psychiatry that refrains from coercion and injustice and has the potential to heal. And probably the most succinct and blunt definition came from our executive editor, Phil Verdon, who said, psychiatry equals the management of mental disorder, democracy is government by the people, so democratic psychiatry is managing mental disorder by way of democratic decisions of everyone involved. Obviously, this raises many questions, hence, Asylum magazine is a forum for debate. Next one. Yes. How long have we got? I don't want to go on there.
The 20 minutes.
Oh, wow. If you drop off, just tell me. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Or now, whatever. Okay, so as well as democratic psychiatry, actually, gone too far. People know. So as well as democratic psychiatry, people often ask us also, why asylum? Why use the word asylum? Well, okay, so we chose the word asylum. I actually wasn't involved in 1986. I got involved in the 91, I think. But I say we as the collective. So we chose the title asylum for its original meaning, through Latin, from Greek to English, as a refuge and sanctuary, and also as there being a right not to be seized. We were also, sorry, go on. It's not from Latin. I thought it was Greek. I thought it was yeah. To Latin, that's what I meant. That's what I said. Greek from Latin. No, from Greek, yeah. Get that right. We were also acutely aware that Asylum was the original title of what became the British Journal of Psychiatry. So we did it quite ironically and purposely in that sense. So why do we still call it asylum? Well, I think we need asylum in 3 different ways still today. Firstly, we still need real asylum, a place of sanctuary and refuge, a space that cannot be violated. And we desperately need this today, as we have indicated in the brochure. But we also need an asylum for radical ideas, a space for excluded, unpopular, marginalised ideas, a refuge from the latest theoretical fads and fashions and orthodoxies and tyrannies of modern mental health practice and modern thinking and theories that surround it. Whether that's recovery, well-being, social inclusion, blah, blah, or even the new radical new orthodoxies, such as the latest recovery gurus or experts. Now, I'm not saying these are necessarily bad things. What I'm saying is all these things need to be thrown up into question. As David Pilgrim once said, there are no experts in mental health, only experts in claiming expertise, which I thought was about right. So we need real asylum, asylum for ideas, and an asylum in a third way, and an asylum for the expression of difficult experiences, of suffering, of madness, of resistance. So these stories can be heard in all their inconvenient truths, because madness is certainly inconvenient. We need to hear stories about suffering and distress, stories which are not theorised out of existence, and nor fitted into nice, neat categories of recovery narratives. And we also need other sorts of stories, stories from disaffected workers, whistleblowers, workers who feel marginalised in the system, families, carers, friends and allies and advocates, and the list goes on. So, after nearly 30 years of inevitable inefficiencies, disasters and chaos, Asylum magazine survives and lives on. But perhaps it should not be a surprise that an amateur outfit of volunteers like ourselves, many with our own problems, should not have severe hiccups, and for which most people kindly forgive us. After a few years' break, from 2007, after the untimely death of our previous editor, Terence McLaughlin, who lived in Stockport, we decided to relaunch. We had about a 3-year break, and we relaunched the magazine in 2010. Phil Verdon came back on board as our executive editor, and we now have PCCS Books who help us distribute and manage our subscriptions, because managing our subscriptions was something we didn't do terribly well. Sadly, in many ways, our time may have finally come. I think we're now entering a period that is increasingly being defined as a crisis in mental health services. There are many conferences now called the crisis in mental health services. And this time may well be known as that. And I think in your exhibition you have the Guardian article from Nathan Filer, which talks about this very issue. And in fact, more and more people are talking now about the reinvention of asylum and what that might mean. Genuine asylum, and what has been lost through the closing of asylums. A good example of that is Barbara Taylor's recent book, The Last Asylum. And that book, because she's quite famous, feminist historian, has generated and galvanised some thinking around this amongst certain sections of academia and the women's movement. So any idea of reopening the asylums is certainly a worrying prospect, and is certainly contentious, not only to many users and survivors, but also to modern policymakers, academics and politicians. But hopefully, at last, the need for genuine asylum can be debated openly and honestly, or perhaps not. And I guess that is the issue that we need to take forward, is to consider how we might do that in a way that's not merely about reopening the things that we want to get rid of. So we continue to take inspiration from the surviving movement in all its forms, and it's evolved and changed over the years. And increasingly there are alliances with the wider disabled people's movement, and also other social movements like the neurodiversity movement. Hold on, am I completely... Where am I up to in that? Next one. Oh yes, I think I completely missed that. Excellent. That's it, yeah, we'll stay there. Okay. Okay, so, and we also take inspiration from things like Occupy. This was the occasional calf in Manchester, down in Fallowfield. The occasional calves were popping up everywhere, and Asylum magazine, we did a session there, and we increasingly do things like that with Ragged University and various organisations like that. We try and get out there and be around new and exciting developments.
So you didn't necessarily like survivors?
Well, that's yes, indeed, yes.
You have to be the right sort of person to participate.
Yeah. Yes. And this is again part of there's an article actually in Asylum magazine after the Occupy stuff saying that very thing, that these things are never easy. Okay?
Specifically.
Right. Okay. We can talk about that later. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these spaces are never entirely open and accepting of everyone, for sure. Okay. But we are heartened by some recent developments in mental health. So despite the doom and gloom about the crisis in mental health services, which certainly I think probably is a crisis, but there are certain things that I want to highlight as a way of hope, if you like. So, firstly is the Survivors History Group, which I think is a wonderful organisation in all its forms. It is really, I think, highlighting comprehensively the history of the movement and different alternatives as well. This logo is interesting because if we go back to the Mental Patients Union original logo, which was the head on a spider and the fish on a hook, this was a doodle that Janet Forge was doing at the time of the first Mental Patients Union meeting. And this could have been the logo of the Mental Patients Union, but they decided to go for the spider caught, the head caught in the spider's web. So Andrew Roberts, founder, member of the Mental Patients Union and of the Survivors History Group, has adopted this logo for the Survivors History Group. And he does it because he says, in it, nothing twitches on a hook and nothing struggles to be free from a net. The fish swims free in the water, the snake moves free in the grass, and the heart beats free in the breast. We are now free, which is a very hopeful and positive message. The second thing I want to highlight are some actual alternatives that are sort of happening in the UK today. The first one is Dial House in Leeds, which is the survivor-run crisis service in Leeds. It's been going for quite a while now and is one of the few survivor-run crisis houses in the country. Open Dialogue UK is a very interesting initiative. It started in Western Lapland in Finland over the last sort of 25, 30 years. And in Western Lapland, it is not an alternative, but it is standard psychiatric practice there. And Open Dialogue is very much what Asylum magazine kind of is all about, really. Or it could be an interpretation of it. In the Open Dialogue, when someone is in crisis, the Open Dialogue approach is very much about what Phil Verdon talked about in his definition of democratic psychiatry, which is everybody involved comes together to talk about, rather than the individual who is designated the mad person gets picked up and taken away, popped in a hospital or popped full of drugs or treated. The whole network has to take responsibility and to think about responses to that. So it's not just the person themselves, the individual being scapegoated by the wider system, if you like. Okay, and the third one is Satirian Network, which has been going for quite a while now, and was sort of developed out of a visit from the psychiatrist who set up Satiria House in America, who then died nearly 10 years ago now, I think. And the Satirian Network was set up to try and set up genuine alternatives, minimal medication, maximum support, houses where people could go through experiences of extreme distress and psychosis, altered states, with minimal medication and maximum support. There isn't a Satiria House in the UK, but there are lots of groups across the country that are trying to set up something like that or to adapt it in some way to context. And the last thing I want to talk about is, I think this is really exciting, is Mad Love. Has anyone heard of this, Mad Love?
Not in 2014.
Mad Love. Well, I'm sure a lot of you have experienced Mad Love, but... But Mad Love is a particular initiative that's being set up by an artist called the Vacuum Cleaner. You know the vacuum cleaner, yeah. Excuse me. And he's based this on his own experience of mental hospitals and his desire to find a positive space for people to experience mental distress and, what he says, potential enlightenment. And he asks, well, if you design your own asylum, what would it look like? So they're doing a kind of consultative process. What's the right word? To get people to say, not just mad people, everybody, to say, if you went crazy, if you lost your mind for a bit, if things were incredibly difficult for you, what sort of place would you want to go? What kind of space what would it look like? What would it feel like? What would it smell like? What would it taste like? And he says, the aim is to build the most crazy, bonkers mental asylum we dare dream of. A desirable and playful place to go mad, a temporary structure which will be reflexive and responsive space for exploring and redesigning madness. You've got a tissue? You've got a tissue? Sorry, I'm in the middle of my... I'm nearly finished as well, but I think I've got... Thank you.
Oh, you've got.
Thanks. Oops. I'm getting these nosebleeds, I don't know why. Excitement, I think. Okay, so yeah, I'm really finished actually. So yeah, I would encourage you to take part in this. If you look up Mad Love and vacuum cleaning, you'll find this on the website. We're reporting on it in Asylum magazine as well. Tell the vacuum cleaner about your dreams, or not. Tell him it's a load of nonsense if you want as well. It's up to you. I'm sure I'll be interested. But the idea is a consultation process will go on in autumn this year, and a temporary space will hopefully be opened, operating on a voluntary admission day hospital inverted commas basis over 6 weeks as an experimental space designed by and for the experience of madness. A challenging idea. Whether we'll pull it off, I don't know, but we certainly hope so. And as I said, this is the kind of thing that we cover in Asylum magazine in all its glory. So please support us. Get involved, subscribe, have a look at the magazine, and spread the word. Thanks for listening.